Afternoon, everybody. I actually have quite a bit here at the top, so bear with me if you can. On Afghanistan, I think you've seen the statement that I just recently put out, but I want to reiterate that the United States condemns in the strongest possible terms the attack that took place today in Kabul. We've seen now reports of yet another attack. We're still getting information about that. But the first one we know killed dozens of Afghans and wounded many more. We certainly send our condolences to the loved ones of all of those who were killed and injured. Attacks like these today only deepen and underscore our support for the people and the government of Afghanistan and its efforts to bring security and stability to their country. We will continue to monitor the situation as closely as we can, knowing now that there are reports of another attack. We don't have any indications that any U.S. citizens were harmed in the attacks in Kabul today. But again, we're watching this very, very, very closely. I do want to give you a readout of a phone call today that the Secretary made to the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Long. He placed a call this morning to the Foreign Minister to express, again, our condolences for the tragic loss of life in the earthquake. He reiterated the commitment of the people of the United States to supporting Ecuadorian citizens in this very, very difficult time. He noted to the Foreign Minister that a USAID Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance team has arrived in Ecuador to coordinate the U.S. response and support, the distribution of emergency relief supplies to earthquake-affected populations. All this support was at the request, of course, of the Ecuadorian government. And finally, he made clear that we stand by and ready to assist in any way possible going forward, again, in keeping with their needs and their requests. On South Sudan, the United States is deeply disappointed by Riek Machar's failure to return to South Sudan's capital of Juba today to form the transitional government of national unity. This represents a willful decision by him not to abide by his own commitments to implement the agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. The United States and other partners have gone to great lengths to facilitate his return, including the return to Juba of his political advance team and his security detail. His failure to go to Juba, despite efforts from the international community, places the people of South Sudan at risk of further conflict and suffering and undermines the peace agreement's reform pillars, which are demilitarizing South Sudan, injecting transparency of public finances, and pursuing justice and reconciliation, all of which offer South Sudan a chance for renewal. We call upon the government to exercise maximum flexibility for the sake of peace and on Machar to return to Juba, as he has promised to do. We will coordinate with our partners on appropriate responses to the obstruction of the peace process, peace agreement by Dr. Machar. On Libya, today, the President issued a new executive order authorizing the United States to impose sanctions on individuals and entities who threaten the peace, security, and stability of Libya. This executive order allows the United States to take action against those who seek to obstruct, undermine, delay, or impede the political transition to the Libyan government of national accord, as well as those who threaten the peace, security, or stability of Libya through the supply of arms or related material. The President took this action in support of Libya's government of national accord, and the United States stands with, as we've said before, Prime Minister al-Sarraj's government as it begins their important work in Tripoli and continues to implement the Libyan political agreement to build a better future for the Libyan people. Following today's authorization, the Department of Treasury designated Khalifa Gawel for being responsible for and complicit in certain activities outlined in this executive order. We're going to continue to consider other actions as appropriate under this executive order. We encourage all Libyans to continue facilitating a peaceful handover of power so that Libya's new leaders can begin the hard work of restoring stability to the country. And finally, on behalf of the State Department, I wish to extend my deepest condolences to the people of Chile on the passing of former President Patricio Elwin. Former President Elwin will be remembered as a leader who did commit to the greater good for the people of Chile. He was a lifelong champion of justice who presided over Chile's peaceful transition from a military dictatorship to a vibrant democracy, and our thoughts and prayers are with his family and with the people of Chile today. Matt?
Right. Get back to Libya in a little bit, but I want to start with Iran and the Secretary's meeting with Foreign Minister Zarif in New York, which I realize is probably not over yet. But
It is not.
understanding, however, that the readout of the meeting was probably already been written, maybe you can offer us a Tuesday preview of the meeting that has begun, or a review.
The meeting is underway, so I'm not going to get ahead of the readout that's coming.
There will be one, though, yes?
There will be one. It'll be a written readout. You'll see it come from Mark because he's up there. So I don't want to get ahead of that, but you're right, the meeting's underway right now. I think I would just reiterate what I said yesterday, that high on the agenda is going to be issues related to the implementation of JCPOA, in particular sanctions relief.
All right, on sanctions relief, the Secretary gave an address last night to J Street in which he talked about the sanctions, the whole deal, the sanctions relief, and what Iran has done to comply with it. And I'm confused about something that he said. He was talking to a group that was supportive of the Iran deal, and therefore, I mean, kind of preaching to the choir a little bit about the merits of it. But he said, and he took issue with groups and people who have criticized the nuclear deal by telling J Street about the arguments, mistaken arguments against, one of which he said was that Iran would get $155 billion in sanctions relief. And I just want to quote him here so it's clear. The Secretary said, "We never thought it would be that. Others thought it would be about $100 billion. We calculated it to be about $55 billion when you really take a hard look at the economy and what is happening. Guess what, folks? You know how much they have received to date as I stand here tonight? About $3 billion. So what we said to people was true." So my first question is, how does Iran getting $3 billion mean that what we said to people was true?
Well, the Secretary is referring to the fact that the exaggerated claims of the amount of assets they would have available to them was nowhere near accurate, and we've been maintaining that for many months now, that it wasn't going to be 100 or 150, that it was more like 50 to 55. So it was much smaller than many of the critics said it was going to be. And he was using our current estimate that what so far, after only 4 months, they've been able to get access to is about $3 billion. So that's, his point was that's indicative of the fact that this isn't some windfall of cash that was going to happen on day one to the exorbitant sum of $100 to $150 billion.
But you yourself admit that they're going to get more. Or your whole argument is they're going to get more. I mean, right now, all you're saying is that if you use if we accept the $55 billion, your figure, the $55 billion is correct, they're still owed $52 billion. Or they stand to get $52 billion.
We still believe that our estimate is accurate, of about 55, somewhere between 50 and 55 billion is about what they'll have available to them through this sanctions relief. Right now, our best estimate is that they've received about $3 billion of that, yes, we still maintain the estimate.
It's not possible that it could be more than $55 billion. It certainly isn't going to be limited to $3 billion. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Well, isn't this an argument? And he's making the Iranians' argument here, right? One of the things that Zarif and other Iranian officials have been complaining about
is it hasn't gone fast enough.
Yeah, that they haven't gotten it. So
he's not.
Aren't they right then?
Well, again, we still believe 50 to 55. It's only been 4 months. So, I mean, nobody said, even at the outset, we said it wasn't going to be this quote-unquote windfall of cash. Yeah. So, no, he's not making the Iranians' argument. He's not making anybody's argument. He's simply stating a mathematical fact.
He's making the administration's argument, which seems to be
certainly
to a crowd that supported the deal.
Certainly he was defending the deal, as he has done staunchly since implementation.
I should have, but I haven't done the math here. So if they get $3 billion every 4 months, how long are they going to have to wait to get to $55 billion?
I don't know that algebra works, Matt. That it's going to be every
nice
4.
Slip, though.
Yeah. Well, I was a history major. The
I don't know that algebra works.
I don't know
math.
that algebra works, Matt.
Gotcha.
That you can't just assume that every 4 months they're going to get $3 billion.
Yeah, but so isn't he though saying that the Iranians are correct when they complain that they have not gotten the sanctions relief yet that has been promised to them?
He wasn't making that overt case that he wasn't arguing the Iranian
That essentially
perspective
is
and
that
case.
I mean, he
But-
was trying to make it the other way around, saying that critics.
He
of
was
the deal
saying
was
that he was reiterating the fact that there's not this big windfall of cash. He wasn't trying to make the Iranians' case that it comports with Iranian concerns that they've expressed. I don't think I can dispute
He
that,
was bragging,
but it
though.
wasn't.
Sounds like he was bragging a little bit that they haven't gotten any money.
He wasn't bragging.
Well, I
Well,
mean,
I
he
know.
was. It sounded like he
what
was
we
like.
said to
No,
people.
Might have sounded like that to you, but that wasn't the. That
but it
wasn't
sounded like he was saying that that he was trying to like placate their concerns that they're not getting the money. At the same time, he's trying to tell the
No,
Iranians they're going to get their money.
I listened to the speech, and I think, and Matt quoted it absolutely correctly. He was making a point about the arguments that we faced at the outset, that there was going to be this windfall, that the $150 billion is just going to fall into the laps of the regime in Tehran, and they were going to use it to fund terror. And his argument last night was that that hasn't occurred.
Yeah, but Kirby, why isn't
And
it?
we said at the time that it wasn't going to occur that way.
Kirby, why isn't it occurred? Is it because of the financial restrictions that the Iranians are arguing about?
I can't, honestly, I don't know, how the pace of sanctions relief is being implemented and executed. And I think, frankly, it's the issue of sanctions relief that we know that's on the minds of Iranian leaders. We fully expect that Foreign Minister Zarif will bring that up today, and again, we'll see where it goes at the end of the afternoon.
Can I just follow up very quickly? I mean, just to understand it clearly, whether it's 5 or 52 or 100, we're talking about Iran's money, right? I mean, that is Iranian money. That is not American money,
Correct.
not taxpayers' money, not something that's not aid or anything like this. This is Iranian money
Correct.
that have been frozen.
Yes.
So in theory, why shouldn't they get it right away?
Oh, again, I'm not an expert on the financial system and how the money gets freed up. I just don't have that level of detail for you. All I can tell you is that, look, and it shouldn't be a surprise that over 4 months, I mean, these sanctions have been in place for a very long time. And there are lots of questions out there, not just in the domestic, banking and business communities, but internationally about how to handle this. Lots of questions. And perhaps maybe some of those questions are and the fact that they're still unanswered by or for some institutions, maybe that's one of the reasons why. I don't know. All I can tell you is that after 4 months, that's our best estimate. And and nobody expected, and nobody should have expected, that it was going to be like sort of a day one. It was just all going to happen. Now, you're right. These are their funds, and under the deal, as long as they continue implementing their obligations, and they have, they're entitled to get that money back. Now, how it happens and the pace, I'm not a financial expert on that. I couldn't tell you the levers and the mechanisms that go into that. We're committed, and we have met all of our obligations. Thus far, Iran has met all of their obligations. And again, this is one of the issues. This is one of the reasons why the Secretary and Foreign Minister Zarif are meeting today to talk about this process. Very much a process kind of discussion.
How can you say you've met all your obligations if they're still missing $52 billion?
They're not missing the money. It just hasn't been all released to them. It's not that it's
All right,
not
well, they haven't
missing,
got- so-
and it's not all.
It's-
It's
I
not
just
all like
seem-
in the United States, like in a
understand.
piggy
It just
bank
seems
here
to
in
me
the
that
State Department that
in
we're just going to break open and
in
give to
making
them.
this comment, it just seems to me that the Secretary is saying
We-
that the Iranians have a point here. So has the administration decided what it's going to do to either ease or clarify this, or to clear up this confusion that exists out there in the international financial system, so that Iran can get the money that you say it's due, which is roughly $55 billion, of which they're still missing 52.
So a couple of points there. One, he wasn't making the case for the Iranians, and if you read the quote, he was simply we can argue that all day, Matt, but that wasn't the purpose. Number two, we continue to work with and consult with banking and business institutions here at home and overseas to explain to them how the sanctions relief process is supposed to work. We actually have officials that are, on the road, actually trying to inform and educate people around the world on how this is supposed to work. And frankly, we talked about this yesterday. It was one of the reasons why Steve Moll sent those letters to governors and to local authorities
Why
to do
did
the
you
same
that
thing.
Before implementation day, while they were doing their kind of due diligence and making good on their commitments, why weren't you putting this all in place and sending letters to the governor and sending people out so that the money could be released on implementation day?
There were education efforts underway as we were getting there, but I think we also needed to wait to get to implementation day to make sure everything was set. And look, this is a process, and we're going to continue to work at that. I can't.
What if the Iranians said to you, well, our making good on our nuclear commitments is a process. No, you needed.
It
they
is a
needed to-
process. They
I
have
know,
said
but,
that.
But there were certain things that they had to do on the outset.
They had to. It took them a while. I mean, they had to work at getting.
I
to
understand,
getting to
but it
implementation
took many-
day was not.
Yeah.
Wasn't the day that the deal was inked. You know that. It took us a while to get to implementation day. We had to take some steps on our part. We did that. We're going to continue to meet our commitments under JCPOA, and we expect them to continue to meet theirs. But look, it is a process on both counts, and we're working at this.
Can we move on to
Well, I just have one more on this. So you said in response to one of Elise's questions, you said that there was this myth out there that the Iranians were going to get $155 billion and dump it all into terrorism and fomenting instability in the region. Back when we were in Davos, the secretary said, I believe it was on CNBC, that there was no doubt that some of the money that Iran got in sanctions relief would be used to
He
go
did
to
say that.
terrorism. Right.
You're right. We've said that.
So what's your estimate of how much of the $3 billion they've gotten so far has gone into funding terrorism or activities that
We don't know.
destabilize the region?
We don't know.
You
We
think
don't
some
have a
of it-
way. We don't have a way. Again, the $3 billion is an estimate at best. We don't have perfect knowledge
Right.
of what has actually been freed up for them, and we don't have perfect knowledge of how every dollar of that is going to be
Would you
spent.
say
And
that-
we and stand by what the secretary said, that it's entirely possible that they can use some of this funding
Right.
to support terrorist networks.
Well, can you say that you think, or the administration believes, that some of the $3 billion
No,
has
I
been
cannot.
used for this?
I cannot say that.
Okay, and
We don't know.
So, but you don't know. So they could have used it all.
Matt,
Right.
we don't know means we don't know.
But you don't think it's zero. You don't think it's
I would not even hazard
all right.
an
But
estimate.
do you assume that some of it has gone into these?
We're not making any assumptions specifically with every dollar that is going to be freed up. What we do know, and we've talked about this before, is they do have significant investment needs, infrastructure and economic investment needs in Iran that we believe will tie up most of the monies that they will get back. But we can't say with certainty that they'll behave that way, that they'll spend the money that way. We just don't know. We don't have a way of tracking every dollar.
Okay.
Again, back to Saeed's point, it's their money.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
How do you see reconciliation talks with the Taliban now, especially considering reconciliation talks
yeah.
with the Taliban now, especially considering a little over a week ago they admitted to trying to kill Secretary Kerry when they launched rockets in Kabul?
Well, I think I'll just be brief here, but I can also point you to the press conference that the Secretary and President Ghani had when we were there in Kabul. They were both committed. Certainly, the United States is committed to seeing an Afghan-led reconciliation process succeed. And to date, it's been very difficult to get it going. And there's a certain onus, obviously, on the Taliban to be willing to participate in that process and to do so in a constructive way. And we haven't seen that happen yet.
But you still want them to participate.
And I'm sorry.
You still want them to participate?
Of course we
in it?
do, yeah. And the attacks, such as we saw today, the one you mentioned the evening that we were in Kabul, certainly are worrisome. and as I said at the outset, underscore our commitment to continuing two things. One, our support for the military mission there, the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and he got a briefing by General Nicholson while we were there, and our support to President Ghani and his political efforts, as well as his efforts to restart the reconciliation process. Nobody said it was going to be easy, and we're mindful of the threat that the Taliban continues to pose to the people of Afghanistan.
But, I mean, this is just the beginning of the fighting season, and don't you think you kind of have an answer in terms of their willingness to join, a peaceful reconciliation process? This is not some small attack. This is one of the largest attacks in some time. It's at the beginning of the fighting season, and it pretty much sends a signal that they're going to keep going through the fighting season. And the president has already announced that he's planning on withdrawing a good half of the troops by the end of the year. So at what point do you take no for an answer?
I don't think that we're at, as you put it, no for an answer. And
You don't think the attack today reflects an unwillingness to join
it
reconciliation process?
certainly doesn't do anything to advance the reconciliation process, Elise, but it doesn't mean that the effort to try to get it restarted is dead, or that President Ghani should just give up and quit trying. And as well as anybody in this room, the Taliban is not a monolithic organization, and not everything is so well coordinated from some sort of central command structure.
Pretty massive attack, though.
That said, nobody's diminishing what happened today or what happened a week or so ago, and the continued violence the Taliban is capable of. And we're obviously mindful that thus far, whether it's in word or deed, they've proven reluctant at best to advance a reconciliation process, and but that doesn't mean we're going to give up on it.
What about in terms of the president's decision to withdraw?
Let me just say one more thing on that, and because we've talked about this before. To the degree that they continue to use terror as a tactic, they will remain legitimate targets of the Afghan National Security Forces, and further justify and validate our counterterrorism mission there in Afghanistan. So it's not like they're being given a free pass here. Go ahead.
In terms of the size of the attack and the inability of the Afghan intelligence forces or ANSF to prevent it, what does that tell you about their kind of readiness to have this drawdown? Especially since it's the beginning of the fighting season, not the end. I mean, the president's going to, if the president is going to make good on his pledge to withdraw the troops, he's going to have to start doing it, in several months.
So you mean our readiness?
Yeah.
I didn't
No, the Afghan readiness
to have. Yeah.
for us to leave. For the
Well,
US to
again,
leave.
you heard President Ghani last week say that he fully respects President Obama's prerogative here in terms of determining force levels, and I don't want to stray into DoD equities, but since it did come up in the press conference in Kabul, I mean, I'll just restate what the Secretary said, which is that this is a decision that rests with the Commander-in-Chief and in consultation with his military commanders. He has made it very clear that he is going to be willing to listen to his military commanders and weigh their advice and recommendations which, as far as I know, have not yet been made. You're right when you said the President decided to go down to about 5,500 at the end of the year. He's also supportive of General Nicholson's desire and effort as the new commander to review the operational landscape and to provide recommendations going forward. As far as I know, that work is still ongoing, and when the general puts it forward, I'm sure that the president will consider it seriously. But I don't know, couldn't even begin to predict what that might be.
Can I change topics?
Sure.
Okay.
On Afghanistan, one more.
Sure.
Earlier today, Russia's presidential envoy for Afghanistan said Russia would no longer consider the Taliban as terrorists and would recognize them as a political force if the Taliban accepted the constitution, ceased hostilities, and cut ties with extremists. And in addition, Russia would want the decision to be approved by Afghan government and UN Security Council Do you think this is helpful to the reconciliation process?
It's pretty darn near identical to the approach that we've taken with respect to the Taliban. So I certainly wouldn't say it's unhelpful. I mean, we've long said that we're not gonna, just by being a member of the Taliban doesn't mean you are in fact a terrorist and therefore are in fact going to be a target of military activity by the Afghan National Security Forces. If you're engaged in acts of terror, if you pose a threat, then obviously you become a legitimate target. So the way you've couched it there, if that's indeed how they have, that's very similar to the approach that we've taken now for about 2 years.
And would you welcome that you and Russia are being more aligned, are in alignment on this? Would you welcome this?
I mean, just rather than welcoming it, I'll just tell you that that is a very similar approach that we have taken now for 2 years, and it certainly is not, if that is in fact their approach, it's not unhelpful to trying to move a political process forward in Afghanistan. But what really matters here is President Ghani and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah and their efforts to try to get at a reconciliation process and their commitment to that, in which they both stated unequivocally when we were in Kabul just a week or so ago. And that's what really matters. That's the opinion, that's the view, that's the perspective that matters the most.
And they said they would want to get approval from the Afghan government and the UN Security Council. Do you think that's an appropriate or necessary process?
I'll let them speak for their views. We've not talked about taking this to the UN Security Council. There's a NATO mission to keep advising and assisting Afghan National Security Forces. There is a U.S. mission there in terms of counterterrorism. That will continue. No decisions have been made yet about the president has decided he's going to get down, he's made the decision of 5,500 by the end of the year, but he's willing to consider views by his military commanders. So, I mean, I think I just leave it at that. I mean, we continue to believe that reconciliation, and we've said this now for a long time, needs to be Afghan-led. Yeah.
Move on, can we move on?
Yeah, sure.
Just
I don't think
okay,
anybody's
very quickly
disputing that.
on the Secretary's speech yesterday.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
J Street, he said, quote, "I can tell you for these next 9 months," talking about the peace process, "we will not stop working to find a way." And he went on to say, "And so we will continue to advance the two-state solution as the only solution because anything else will not be Jewish and will not be democratic, and we understand that," unquote. Now, does he have, is there something in the offing? Is there going to be some sort of an initiative that the Secretary might undertake, perhaps either, because we're talking about a very short period of time.
The Secretary is very mindful of the time left while he has in office, and he's also mindful of the importance of this issue. And I don't think I can improve upon his words from last night, that he is very committed to continuing to try to work to get to a two-state solution. Does he have an initiative or an announcement to make? I have nothing for you on that today. I can just tell you that the point he was trying to make last night was that for as long as he's the Secretary of State, he's going to continue to work on this and work as hard as he can.
The reason I asked this question, because only months ago, maybe a couple months ago, the President himself said there's not likely to be anything. But listening to the Vice President and listening to the Secretary of State, they're basically saying that this thing is alive and kicking, and we're going to push for it.
I don't know that anybody said it wasn't still an objective. We've also said, I know I've said, and I know the Secretary has said, that it's up to the leadership there in the region, all parties, the leadership on all sides, to take the kinds of affirmative steps and initiatives to get us there. We can't do it for them. It can't be legislated externally. It has to be something that they decide to move forward on. And as both, I think, as both the Secretary and the Vice President said last night, it's difficult to see that way right now because that sort of leadership isn't being fully exerted. But that doesn't mean that we aren't still committed to it, that we aren't still going to try to help them get to a position where they can make these decisions and they can take the kinds of actions to reduce the violence, restore the calm, and move forward. I don't see the gap, quite frankly, the way you've described it.
Let me just-
We're all still committed to it.
Just a quick questions on related. Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, said in Germany that he denounces all forms of terrorist activities. Is that enough? I mean, he was talking about the bus bombing yesterday in Jerusalem. So first, if you have any more information on the bus bombing, and second, is that enough by Abbas just to say we condemn or we are opposed to all acts of terrorism, whether it's against Palestinians
Well, we certainly
or
welcome
Israelis?
the comments. That's obviously encouraging. But as I've said before, words are not going to be sufficient. As it's not just about rhetoric. It's about action. It's about deeds. It's about real leadership, getting us closer to a two-state solution. That's what we really need. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, we welcome those sentiments, and we would associate ourselves with those sentiments. There's no justification for terrorism. Now, on the issue of the bus attack, I don't have any additional information on this. The Israeli authorities are investigating this. They are treating it as if it is an act of terrorism. We have no indication that it isn't, in fact, an act of terrorism. But I'd refer you to Israeli authorities for any kind of updates.
Can we change the
Finally, I
subject?
promise this is really a quick one. The journalists, Palestinians and international journalists, are saying that they are now receiving protection equipment in Gaza, like PPEs, personal protection, or flak jackets, or shields, or something like this. Do you have any? First of all, you have any information on that? Or would you encourage the Israelis to allow this equipment to protect journalists that report from Gaza?
I don't have anything for you on that site. I'm sorry.
Can we change the subject?
Question, it'll be quick because I think you're going to have to take it. Yesterday, a group of 20, I think it's 28, but I might be counting wrong, senators wrote to the secretary saying that the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, one of the secretary's big interests, has admitted as a member the state of Palestine, which the senators say would trigger U.S. law, meaning that bars the United States from funding UN agencies or affiliates which recognize the state of Palestine. I know that this letter was just sent yesterday, so I don't expect you to have a full answer now. But I'm wondering, one, does the administration believe that the UNFCCC is a UN agency or an agency or affiliate of the UN that would be covered by this U.S. law? And two, if it does, will it stop any funding for it as the law calls for?
Well, we are aware of the letter, but you're right, Matt. I'm going to have to take that, and I'll get back to you on that. You want to change?
No, okay. Can we stay on in Israel? Yesterday, Jordan has decided to call off a plan to install surveillance camera at Jerusalem Holy Site. Do you have anything on it?
Yes, I would ask you to consult yesterday's transcript.
Thank you so much.
I dealt with it extensively yesterday. I don't think I can prove upon my eloquence.
Has the secretary, did the secretary make any calls this morning on Syria peace talks?
Not that I'm aware of. The only call that I'm tracking is the one to the Ecuadorian foreign minister about the earthquake.
Okay.
I'm not aware of
And do you believe that the opposition says that the truce has ended? There's been airstrikes that killed 40 people in this marketplace in opposition territory. Do you know is the U.S. ready to say who actually is responsible for those?
I've seen the reports of that. It is our understanding at this time that it was most likely regime forces, but information is still coming in. So I want to be a little careful here on how I couch that. And it has been, as we've said, by and large, the majority of the violations have been by the regime. We have reason to believe at this point that was the case with this particular bombing.
Do you believe that these peace talks, the opposition has basically said that the talks have been suspended indefinitely, not just to Friday, Do you really believe that under these circumstances and in this atmosphere that those talks can take place and come to a conclusion
You mean this week?
this week or the next few weeks?
You want to try it?
While they're
Just-
while the regime is violating this, as you said, it appears that most of the violations are theirs. While the regime is violating,
Yep.
do you think it's appropriate for talks to continue, or should there be some kind of consequences for the regime and to change their calculus, as the secretary always says, to bring them back to the table in earnest?
Okay, there's a lot there. The short answer is we continue to believe in the political process and in the importance of these talks. What the special envoy said yesterday was that both sides had agreed to stay in Geneva, that talks would be paused. So there are no active, as far as I know, no active talks going on right now, but they are still there, and that they all agreed they would sort of reassess the way forward on Friday. So that's one. Number two, nobody ever thought that with this new round of talks that all the problems would get solved. The goal was to start, and the key word there is start, having a conversation about the political transition itself. And they did start. Now, obviously, the opposition, in light of the continued violations of the cessation, and they noted the concern we share, the lack of access of humanitarian aid and assistance, which the regime continues to stifle, has led them, compelled them to pause their participation in the talks. So we understand the concerns over that. But nobody ever thought that this week in Geneva would be the end-all, be-all of the political process or the talks themselves. And I thought Mr. de Mistura was very clear about that yesterday. That when we started, both sides were very, very far apart. They are still very far apart, and he had no expectations that they were going to draw dramatically closer this week in Geneva, and that there will have to be many more rounds of discussions before we can get to any progress towards, further defining the political way forward. I think everybody is mindful of the difficulty here. Now, to your point, Elise, obviously, when there still continues to be violations of the cessation, and there continues to still be people that are being barrel bombed and gassed and denied basic food, water, and medicine, that makes it very difficult for the opposition to participate fully in these talks, and we understand that, which is why the cessation was so important to have it in place. And I would remind you that while I'm certainly not going to walk you away from the notion that there have been additional violations in the last week or so. The violence has increased from what it was a week ago. It is still dramatically down from what it was just a couple months ago, before the cessation, to the degree, I think Mr. de Mistura said it was about 70%, where it had been 80 to 90% reduction in violence. It's now about 70. So the trend lines are not going in the right direction, but it is still a noteworthy reduction in violence. And more Syrians today are, even with the increase in tensions, they're still living safer, not completely safe, but safer lives than they were before the cessation. So we still believe the cessation is in place, that it is still largely holding, and that it is important to keep it in place and to keep it going. And we'd like to see, frankly, the conditions improve, not decrease. But we're very mindful of the tensions that it's creating on the political process.
So you believe that you can salvage these talks, because the mood in Geneva is less optimistic than it is here. Do you believe you can still salvage those talks?
Before I answer the second question, it's not like we're looking at this through rose-colored glasses. It's not like we don't see what's going on in Geneva for exactly what it is. We have, our special envoy, Michael Ratney, is there. He's monitoring this as best he can. He's not a participant, but he's there. And we're very mindful of the breakdown in the talks this week. And nobody is fooling ourselves here, that it is, that it's becoming resoundingly successful or easy this week. Not at all. But do we think that there's still a purpose in this process and in trying to get it back on track and to move it forward? Absolutely, we do. I wouldn't use the verb salvage the way you did, but I would say that we certainly believe in the value of this and in trying to get it back on track.
Well, don't you think perhaps this is a ploy by the Syrian regime and perhaps Russia to get the opposition to quit the talks so that the regime says that it doesn't have a partner?
I can't speak for the Assad regime. We don't talk directly with them. Again, we judge actions, not words, and by their
Well, do
actions,
the
they are
actions say
certainly
that?
by their actions they are certainly not keeping their commitments and their obligations that Russia assured us that they would do using their influence. I would tell you that the Russian government remains, again, from the communications that we've had directly with them and with Foreign Minister Zarif, they remain committed to this political process.
Right, but what I'm saying is, and this is what Stefan de Mistura kind of said last time when the opposition had to leave the talks, or they didn't start on time, because they were saying, and there were U.S. officials that were saying the same, that what the regime was doing was maybe there was a technical cessation of hostilities, but they were pushing the opposition with violations so that the opposition would leave the talks, and then the regime would say, well, we don't have a partner in these talks, and go back to its full-scale assault.
So are you asking that Russian support?
Are you
for
afraid this is the
Assad-
beginning of a pattern that is trying to push the opposition out of talks?
We certainly hope not. And we've seen no indications from the Russian side that that's their intent, that they are anything other than 100%
Are they
committed
going
to
to
the
tell you
political
that's their
process.
intent, though?
Well, you asked me what do we think they're up to? I mean, they should speak for their intentions and motivations. Everything they've said and everything we've seen coming from the Russian side is that they remain committed to the political process and to seeing it succeed.
Toby, I just want to go
So
back to
I don't know
something.
how else to put it.
I just want to go back to something you said. So the opposition says that the truce has ended, but you're saying that it's largely still holding.
The cessation of hostilities,
Yeah.
that's what we call it,
Yeah.
is still holding. It is. Now, it's fragile, but we continue to see that it's still holding.
I don't understand how you can say the cessation of hostilities is in place or is holding, and then the next sentence later say we're not looking at this through rose-colored glasses. No one believes that it's holding. I mean, it might exist on a piece of paper someplace, but if you look at the statements coming out from the opposition and the government accusations of rebel violations, you're the only one who thinks that it's still there, still exists.
I don't think I'm the only one, Matt.
All right. Well, maybe there's some blind guy, in somewhere. No one. Both sides. All the sides that are supposed
come
to
on
be
now.
actually adhering to the cessation of hostilities, none of them say that it's still in
Look,
place.
if you're using a binary definition here, and that one shot fired means that it's no longer holding, if that's your definition, then that's
I don't
your
think
definition
that's
of it.
what they're saying.
But-
There's barrel bombs going off.
Absolutely.
I mean, my God, this is a.
Guys, you don't.
How about the binary
you don't
equation,
have to-
true or false? How's that?
No,
Does
you
that
can't,
work for you?
because you can't
You
do it
can't?
that way. And you're not telling me something I don't know. I've been saying it for the last few days. In fact, I said it yesterday. We continue to see that the regime continues to violate the cessation and does continue to drop barrel bombs. And we do think they were responsible for this terrible attack today. That doesn't mean that the cessation isn't holding in other places inside Syria. There have been violations of the cessation since the day it was announced.
And you've always placed the blame on the regime. I mean,
Largely.
you know beyond the shadow of any doubt that most violations are committed by the Syrian regime.
We still believe most of the violations are
how
from
do
the
you-
regime,
how-
but I'm not saying they all are.
okay.
And folks, it doesn't, just because there are violations, and it doesn't mean that we don't take them seriously, it doesn't mean that we don't recognize the impact they're having on the political process. We do. And I still maintain that we're not looking at this through too optimistic of a view here. We recognize the challenge that it's placing and the stress it's placing on the political process, but it doesn't mean that still, and I can point you back to what the special envoy, the UN special envoy, who isn't blind, who said himself yesterday in Geneva that 70%, there's still a 70% reduction of violence in the country, and that he himself felt that the cessation was still holding largely. But he also said, as I've said today, it's fragile. We recognize that.
If the opposition has said that it's over, if they launch loads of attacks tomorrow, there'll be violations of a cessation of hostility that they don't no longer recognize.
Well, look, I'm not going to guess about what's going to happen on the battlefield tomorrow.
But if they say they're no longer party to a cessation, why would we hold them to anything?
Well, let's see where we are tomorrow.
Would you-
I'm not going to guess about where things go
Would you
tomorrow.
urge them to go back to the talks if we were maintaining a 70% reduction level? Or do we have to
We're
wait till we
not,
get
I
back
don't
to a
think we're
90%
tying
reduction level?
participation in the talks to a certain percentage level of violence. We would like to see,
But do you
that we would
today
like to
urge
see-
them back into the talks?
we have continued to try to urge them to participate fully in the talks, absolutely. We also, that said, recognize the concerns and the stress and the pressure that they're under, given the regime
You don't
violations.
think that the concerns and the cessations that exist at this moment that you've already acknowledged are sufficient to warrant their walkout then?
I'm not going to make a judgment about their decision. They've made this decision. We understand the concerns and the frustration that they have expressed. We obviously would like to see the talks continue, recognizing, of course, that the more that the regime violates the cessation and the more the regime prevents the delivery of humanitarian aid and assistance, it makes it that much harder for them to do that. Are we continuing to encourage their participation in this despite the violations? Absolutely we are. It would be ridiculous for us not to. But that doesn't mean we don't also understand their reasons and their frustrations.
Will Plan B, you know, if the talks fail completely, will Plan B to go full steam ahead on arming the opposition?
Look, I'm not going to.
Because that's what's being said.
Saeed, I know what's being said. Our focus is on Plan A. That's where the Secretary's head is. That's where his focus is on. Is on making sure the political process moves forward. Are we all?
Or in Syria, and this is directly related to the U.S. government actions. So from this podium, you and other spokespeople have lauded the work of the Syria Civil Defense Group that is known as the White Helmets. You're familiar with their work? They're the guys who rescue people from attacks.
Okay.
You're not familiar with them?
I'm not an expert in this particular group, but
Okay, well, it's a group that has been praised by the U.S. government, including you, I believe, from this podium, certainly Mark. Anyway, the head of this group was supposed to come to the United States to get an award from Interaction, which you might know is a big umbrella group for NGOs. Last night, as he tried to get in, he was denied entry. This man's name is Raid Salah. I'm wondering if you can explain why he would be turned away from the United States.
I cannot. I've not seen that report, and
Can you check
and
it
can't
out?
comment. I can, but I would also, remind you again, it's ICE and Department of Homeland Security that makes these kinds of decisions. But I can't confirm it.
Don't you work with them on this kind of stuff?
He clearly had a visa. He presented himself to U.S. authorities.
Our job is to
So you
work.
gave him a visa.
Our job is to work the visa process,
Can
but
you-
the decisions about entry made on site are made by the Homeland Security Department and ICE, and it's not as if there's at that level, at that tactical level, there's some sort of muscle and sinew connecting them to here to Foggy Bottom on this. These are decisions that they have to make. So I will check into it, but
Thank you.
my guess is that we're going to refer you
Well,
to
they
ICE
don't,
on this.
okay, they don't do briefings like this once a week, let alone 5 days a week. So if you could push them, it would be great to get an answer on why he was denied.
We'll take the question and
Thank you.
we'll refer. Are we good on Syria?
No, one, a couple more.
Whoa, back there. You got me fooled there, Pam. You're normally over
I
there.
know. First of all, concerning the Syria ceasefire task force that the U.S. and Russia are chairing, any indication on when we'll hear back from them with initial findings on some of these violations that they're looking into? And then secondly, one of the other things that the opposition group called for today was a renewed push from the International Syria Support Group to intervene in the humanitarian crisis and also look into what it says are the regime ceasefire violations. Are there any behind-the-scenes talks going on when this group might meet again?
Well, I don't normally talk about behind-the-scenes talks of any kind, but there's there's not an expectation that the cessation task force is going to issue some sort of final report. The job is to catalog and to document and to analyze as best we can, violations of the cessation, and to do everything we can to present in real time what we're learning, to try to get them stopped. It's not a task force in a military sense that they're going to go out and physically stop cessations. That's not the purpose. As for humanitarian aid and assistance, there are predominantly the UN, but other international non-governmental agencies that are trying to get the aid and assistance to people in need. What we need is the regime to allow that access to occur, and thus far that's proven very, very difficult. But there are bodies already there, set up and organized to deliver these goods.
At some point, will we see something public from the ceasefire task force on what it has been cataloging?
I'm not aware of any a public report, as I said, that the task force is prepared to submit or to distribute. I don't know.
Is that because
I don't know.
Is that because you don't agree on who is responsible? That you're not making these findings?
No, I think you're thinking about the work in the wrong way. That the task force is set up to monitor as best they can in real time violations of the cessation, and to then push that information out to those who have influence over those who are doing the fighting, and to get them to stop. That's the goal.
So if you are having all these violations that you say are from the regime, and the person or the country that has the most influence at this point probably would be the Russians, and they're chairing that task force, then why do you think that there hasn't been lessening of these violations?
That's a great question for Moscow, and to speak to the degree to which they're using enough influence on the Assad regime. And I think, I'd point you back to the President's conversation with President Putin yesterday, and conversations that I've read out recently between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Kerry, where a key component of those discussions are exactly that, to urge the Russians to do more, to use their influence in a more constructive, more assertive manner, to get the regime to comply.
Just a few minutes ago, you were saying that you have every indication that the Russians are still committed
They are.
to the cessation of hostilities. Yet they're not using their influence at the same. Those are two inconsistent statements.
I don't know that they're inconsistent. They still are committed.
They say they're committed.
They still say they're committed to the political process in Geneva. They are signatories of all the communiques and of the UN Security Council resolution, which codifies the political process that continues to be worked there in Geneva. And they have in the past used their influence to try to change the calculus of Bashar al-Assad. But because we keep seeing violations of the regime, we keep making the case, and we'll continue to do so to the Russians, that we want them to do more. We want more influence, more pressure put on Bashar al-Assad to do the right thing. So it's not inconsistent. It's a matter of degrees. That we think they can do more doesn't mean that they aren't intrinsically still committed to seeing the political process succeed.
Process, and I understand that the two are linked, but you can be. Let's just take the political process off the table for the minute. They're signatories to the cessation of hostilities, and are a chairman of the task force on the violation of these hostilities.
That's right.
Yet the violations are continuing. So how can you say that the Russians are committed to keeping the peace and lessening the violence when they're not putting pressure? When you're saying also that they're not putting pressure on the
We still believe they're committed to the process, Elise, but we want them to use their influence more assertively to get Bashar al-Assad to comply. I mean, they're both true. Again, it's not like we're giving him a free pass here. I mean, we continue to make this case with Russian leaders.
Just one more on
Ukraine.
Let me go back here. Go ahead.
Do you have anything on the high-profile Ukrainian female pilot who is soon to be released, according to an announcement from the Ukrainian president? And her lawyer said that as soon as the end of this week, she will be released.
I don't. I mean, we still want to see Nadia Savchenko return to Ukraine and to her family where she belongs. We still maintain that she's been unjustly detained, but I don't have any additional information.
You may refer me to the White House, but you want her to try. Yesterday, there's a phone call between President Obama and Russia President Putin. Do you know if this is discussed during the conversation?
I would point you to my colleagues at the White House to speak to the president and his conversations.
Do you see her release coming? Do you think Russia is going to get some political and economic gain out of this?
You're asking me to predict her release. I can't do that. We obviously continue to call for it on the face of it. She needs to be returned to Ukraine. She's been unjustly detained. I got it. I got your hands up. Just give me a second. She needs to come home. Period. And but I can't be predictive. I can't tell you what the odds are, or I've seen these press reports that you're referring to. I can't speak to the veracity of them. We continue to make the case that she needs to be returned. She needs to come home.
Are you aware of any of the prisoners or hostage swap plan on the way between?
I've seen press reports only. I have nothing to confirm one way or the other about this. So I just don't have anything for you on that right now. Go ahead.
Okay. On China, do you have any comment on the landing of a Chinese military aircraft on Fire Reef from Sunday?
Seen reports of that. It's difficult to understand why they, if it's true, and we have no reason to doubt it, that why they would use a military aircraft for, some sort of medical treatment mission or evacuation or whatever it was they were doing. It's difficult to understand why they needed a military aircraft for that. So, again, we continue to make the case that militarization of outposts in the South China Sea is counterproductive to peace and stability in the region. But I'd point you to the PLA to speak to why they chose this particular aircraft for that particular mission. It's difficult to see why it was necessary from our perspective.
So the
Civilian plane, you would not have an issue?
It's if you have
I mean, the
workers,
U.S. runs medical trips on military aircraft all the time.
Look, I mean, we're not going to deny medical aid to people that need it. So, all I'm saying is that it's difficult to understand why it had to be a military aircraft.
My question is your issue is the fact that it was a military aircraft, or your issue is the fact that it was any plane at all?
Well,
landing on the reef.
as I understand it,
Yeah.
the workers were working on further infrastructure improvements of a military nature. So that still's a problem, right?
Yeah.
But if they're sick and they need help,
Right.
we're not gonna
So they should
we're not
fly
gonna
on a
take an issue
civilian
with them getting help. We're simply asking the question. It seems odd that it had to be a military aircraft when it could have easily just been a civilian aircraft to get these folks the help they
That's
needed.
just kind of odd. I mean, what difference does that make what kind of plane it was?
One could argue that it's just another sign that the Chinese are willing to keep militarizing the effort in general.
But couldn't it also be a sign that a military plane happened to be the one that could get there
Could very well be,
quickest?
which is why I
Fastest.
said
All
it's
right.
difficult to understand why it had to be a military aircraft.
Foreign
go ahead.
ministry officials have responded and said that it shouldn't be surprising given that it's Chinese territory. Do you have a response to that?
I'm not going to respond in any other way than I've already done. I think I've reacted to it. Yeah.
In return for the recent military assistance, the Pentagon says they expect the Peshmerga to play, quote unquote, a critical role. Do you share that as the State Department, that the Kurds will be an important element to retake this Arab city? Because there has been some historic animosity. And do you think they will be welcomed by the Arab civilians in the city?
I can't look. You're asking me again to predict the future. They have played a vital role thus far in the fight against Daesh. Our commitment to them remains. I've talked about this. We talked about this yesterday. Nothing's going to change about our commitment to helping them through and with the government of Iraq and Baghdad. But as for predicting battlefield success or the degree to which people are welcomed. I'm not going to do that, and I'm certainly not going to get into talking about military operations.
Because they're certainly not welcoming Shia militias. I just wonder whether you believe the Kurds will receive the same kind of.
I simply am not going to make a prediction about the degree to which people are welcomed or not welcomed. Peshmerga forces have been brave and courageous in the fight. We have, through the government of Iraq, supported them. We will continue to do that. I would point you to the Defense Department and the announcements they made yesterday for more detail on that. Nothing's going to change about our commitment to helping Iraqi security forces and Peshmerga forces defeat Daesh.
I have just one more question on Afghanistan and a separate question on Saudi Arabia, if I may. As I understood, you said you would like to see reconciliation talks with the Taliban despite the attacks. Can specifically those who carried out the recent attacks and targeted Secretary Kerry participate in the talks?
The short answer to your question is no, right? I mean, because we've said that we want to see the Taliban return to the table and to reconciliation, but to do so, they've got to renounce violence and terror. They have to support the Constitution and the reconciliation process itself. So it's difficult for me to see how somebody who's capable of that sort of violence can be part of a reconciliation process. But again, the lines are very clear about what the expectations are of the Taliban to participate in a reconciliation process.
On Saudi Arabia, does the administration believe that no current or former Saudi official or member of the royal family was in any way involved in the 9/11 attacks?
Look, I'm not going to relitigate history here. You can go online and see the story of the attacks and how it happened and who was responsible. And I'm not going to relitigate it here.
But can you say that no, President Obama
as it
is heading
says
to
in the
Saudi
report,
Arabia.
there's no indication that Saudi officials or the Saudi government was behind or supporting in any way those attacks. It's all there. The public record is all there for you to see, and I'm certainly not going to relitigate that history here today. Yeah.
Hold on a second. Before Dave makes a good point here. You're advising people to go online to find out the real story of 9/11? Because there's a lot of stuff out there online.
I meant the 9/11 Commission report, which is
Thank you.
online. Of course you know that. That's the same tie you wore yesterday, by the way.
I'm sorry, yeah, and I've also got some soup on it today.
I see that. Go ahead, you had a question.
No, I was just being sarcastic.
Oh, you're being sarcastic?
Yeah. Well, you say the record is online. There are 28 pages of it not online.
Well, look, again, the 9/11 Commission report is pretty exhaustive.
Mm-hmm.
It states clearly who is responsible for the attacks on 9/11. And for us to sit here this many years later and try to debate it, I think, is just a fool's errand.
Yeah, thank you. From Japan, let me just follow up the secretary's trip last week to Hiroshima.
Yeah.
He mentioned at the press conference, he would explain to the president what he experienced in Hiroshima. Did the secretary meet and explain to the president? If so, can you share with us what's the response from of the president?
No. No, I can sit up here and talk for Secretary Kerry all day, but I will not talk for President Obama. That's
Did he meet
at the White
and
House
talk
is
about this
responsible
issue
for that.
last week?
The Secretary has, as you might expect, because it was such a powerful experience, he's certainly shared that experience with others in the government. I'm not going to speak to private conversations. And you heard him, you were there, and you heard how the visit affected him and how he would continue to urge everybody of all walks of life to go visit the Peace Park and the museum. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Any readout on Secretary's meeting with the BBG today?
Well, we can issue a short readout after this. It was a useful discussion. The Secretary appreciated the opportunity to meet with them again to talk about ways in which we can continue to try to get more effective in the information environment, particularly when it comes to countering violent extremism. Last one.
Just on the issue of the 9/11 bill making its way through Congress, after the administration came out against it, a number of senior Republicans said today that they're open to revising the legislation, and Speaker Ryan said, we want to make sure we're not making mistakes with our allies. What is the administration's view on how the legislation would make a mistake with our allies?
I talked about this yesterday, so I'd point you to the transcript as well as my colleague at the White House, but essentially we believe it sets a potentially harmful precedent going forward in terms of the sovereign immunity that the United States also enjoys overseas. But I'd encourage you to look at yesterday's transcript.
How would they fix the bill?
We're going to continue to consult with Congress. I'm not going to get into legislative remedies here from this podium.
Are there
Thanks.
negotiations going on though with Congress about? Sounds like there are some competing drafts going on.
All I can say is we're going to continue to consult with members of Congress, and we don't obviously
What does
support it in
does
its.
consult mean negotiate
It
on?
means consult and communicate and talk with them about their concerns and about our concerns. Thanks, everybody.